Ah, here we are again, ready to embark on a journey full of dust carried by the winds of history. And why do you think we're here? Well, hold on tight, because I'm going to tell you a story of power, loyalty, betrayal, and nobility that begins in the world where swords shine, castles rise, and knights fight for honor. You have heard of the fall of the Roman Empire, of the glory days, when that great giant once controlled all of Europe. But as that splendor slowly gave way to chaos and uncertainty, people sought protection and order. That's when the first sparks of feudalism began to glow. This new order completely changed the life of the common man. Landowners, lords, serfs, and of course, knights in armor, sworn to honor. They were all part of this new world. But how? How did such a different system come into being after the fall of Rome? Why were people bound together for land and shaped their lives by wars and oaths? Today, we will get to the root of it all. But we will not just fill this story with wars or rules. We will get lost in life, in the complexity of relationships, in people's struggle for survival. Let me leave you with this question as we take the first step. Was the fall of the Roman Empire really the end or the beginning of a new era? Here, we're going to cut through the mists of time to find the answer to that question. Are you ready? Then let's begin. Rome, once the center of the world, an empire seen as the reflection of the gods on earth. Such splendor that in its forums philosophers debated on freedom, its legions made the world tremble, its temples stood as majestic as the gods. But every rise has a fall, my dear friends. And Rome, at its height, was on the fast track to its fall. In the last days of Rome, its cities were no longer as glorious as they once were. Abandoned roads, emptied villages, and starving populations. But the real blow began not with barbarian raids from outside, but with decay from within. Economic crises, an unfair tax system, and corrupt rulers were shaking the foundations of the empire. You know how the roots of a mighty tree slowly decay and still look majestic from the outside. Let me take you back even further. In the 3rd century, Rome was beginning to show signs of disintegration due to constant throne fights and the maverick behavior of the legions. In those dark days, when several different emperors were enthroned and deposed in a single year, the people began to ask, who will save us? However, while the eastern part of the empire remained more stable, the western part was on the verge of collapse. While the east continued its glory in Constantinople, the Western Roman Empire became a target for barbarian tribes. In those days, a name echoed: Alaric. The leader of the Visigoths recognized the weakness of Western Rome. In 410, he broke through the gates of Rome and sacked the city. Rome, the most powerful city in the world for 1,000 years, was being crushed under the boot of Alaric's armies. This sack was the beginning of the end of Western Rome. No one believed that Rome would ever be the same again. And finally, In 476, a young boy emperor, Romulus Augustulus, was deposed by Odoacer, the leader of a Germanic tribe. Yes, my dear friends, this was more than the fall of an emperor. It was the complete collapse of a world order. There was no more Rome. The people had grown accustomed to the might of Rome, had lived in its safe arms, and now, who would protect them in the vacuum left by this great empire? After the fall of Rome, Europe was thrown into a maelstrom of chaos and turmoil. As barbarian tribes took over former Roman lands, order became impossible to maintain. Trade came to a near standstill. Roads fell into ruins. Cities were sacked. People began to band together in small communities to survive. After the fall of Rome, Europe was looking for a savior. At this point, a near power appeared on the scene. These lords were the people who defended their lands with sword and force. They offered security that Rome's central authority could not provide. But this security came at a price. Peasants would work on the lands of these lords, give them a large part of what they produced, and in return, they would live under their protection. This is how the first seeds of feudalism were sown. But this new order did not only provide security, it also completely changed the way of life of the people. Imagine a peasant working in his lord's fields at sunrise in the morning and praying behind a castle wall in the evening. Everything depended on the pleasure and power of the lord. Once upon a time, being a Roman citizen meant living in law and order. Now this order was at the tip of the sword of a powerful lord. As the feudal system grew, the landscape of Europe began to change. Castles built along the plains and valleys symbolized the new authority. The walls of these castles were not just stone, they were also a border where fear and trust coexisted. Those inside the castle were safe, but for those outside, the world was cruel. Feudalism was not only a social order, it was also a necessity. The chaos that began with the fall of Rome created another order. But inside this order, was life really better for ordinary people? Or had they lost their freedom for the sake of security? Now I leave you with the question. In this new order, were these lords merely protectors, or were they small-scale dictators? And at the very center of this order was a towering figure, the knights. In the next episode, let's discover the warrior heroes of this new world and the birth of the culture of chivalry. Are you ready? Now we embark on a journey to the knights who shine in the shadow of swords, armor, and honor. Ah, my friends, after Rome disappeared like a star from the glorious sky, the world was thrown into chaos. That great empire was the glue that held Europe together. But when that glue unraveled, what was left was a shattered mosaic. There was conflict around every corner, and uncertainty in every valley. It was in these dark times that a new order began to sprout from the ashes of Rome. The barbarian kingdoms. These kingdoms were actually communities of barbarian tribes. Tribes like the Visigoths, Franks, Ostrogoths, and Vandals competed with each other to fill the void left by Rome. But this competition was not just for land or power. It was also an attempt to establish a new order. Let me take you along the cobbled, blood-scented roads of these barbarian kingdoms. After the fall of Rome, The Visigoths sought a new home in Western Europe. Although they had sacked Rome under Alaric's leadership, they had a long-term plan to settle and establish a kingdom. When they began to rule in Spain, they modeled their system of government after the old Roman institutions. But let's not forget that this was no mere imitation. The Visigoths took the Roman legal system and blended it with their own traditions. Thus, they laid the foundations of Europe's local government systems that would later evolve into feudalism. Now I take you to the land of the Franks, who, under the Merovingian dynasty, were rapidly growing in power and poised to inherit Rome's legacy. But the real transformation began with a leader named Clovis. Clovis made history not only for his military achievements, but also for his political acumen. By converting to Christianity, he both united his people and won the support of the church. This strategic move made the Franks the most powerful kingdom in Europe. The foundation laid by Clovis would pave the way for the rise of great leaders like Charlemagne in the years to come. The Franks perfectly institutionalized the barbarian tribal understanding of local government. They built a system in which a lord ruled each region, and the people were subordinate to these lords. This was the period when the seeds of feudalism were sown all over Europe. The Ostrogoths. After the fall of Rome, they took the fate of Italy in their hands. Their leader Theodoric was more than a barbarian king. He had a great admiration for Rome's cultural heritage. He tried to rebuild Italy, to bring harmony between the Romans and the Goths. But this harmony lasted only until the East fell under the shadow of the Byzantine Empire. The Ostrogoths were a people who had proven themselves both as warriors and rulers. In their system of government, they skillfully balanced between strong leadership and local autonomy. This structure became a model that inspired the birth of feudalism. While the barbarian kingdoms were filling the vacuum left by Rome, they were also developing a new understanding of governance. In this emerging understanding, ensuring the security of the people was the most important element. However, this security was provided not by the central authority, but by local lords. Each lord was like the king of his own region. This model of local governance served as a bridge from barbarian kingdoms to feudalism. But, my friends, can we say that this system actually worked? Even if security was ensured, a balance was struck at the expense of the freedom of the common people. Peasants were now dependent on their lords, not just to eat, but to survive. In this new world where the powerful ruled, how far could the voice of the people be heard? As the barbarian kingdoms established their own order, who do you think was at the center of this new system? Warriors? Lords? Clerics? But one of them shone brightest of all: knights. In the next episode, we will explore the rise of knights, the symbol of armor and power in this new order, and the foundations of chivalric culture. Are you ready? Because the next story is hidden in the shine of armor. My friends, imagine a world where vast and fertile lands meet the sky. But this world was in such turmoil that every piece of land had become a battlefield, and every valley echoed with acclaim. In this chaotic scene, the Frankish kingdom and its great leader Charlemagne introduced a system that changed the face of Europe. The first traces of feudalism were laid here. I will tell you how the orders issued from Charlemagne's pen and the decisions taken on the battlefields shaped the beginning of an era. Charlemagne was not just the king, my friends. He was also a visionary. By the late 8th century, the Frankish kingdom was one of the most powerful powers in Europe. Under Charlemagne's leadership, this kingdom not only expanded, but also began to sow the seeds of a new order. Charlemagne used the conquered lands not only to control them, but also to create a new social order. So how? Let's analyze step by step. Under Charlemagne, lands were not just an asset, they were a symbol of power and loyalty. When Charlemagne expanded his empire, he needed a system to manage and protect his new acquisitions. This is where pieces of land called fiefs came into play. A fief was a piece of land granted by a lord to a vassal, a warrior who had sworn an oath of loyalty in exchange for military service. The vassals both cultivated the land and, when necessary, stood by the king on the battlefield. Charlemagne worked this system so skillfully that each vassal became an intermediate link, serving both his king and his local people. The feudal system was not just about the distribution of land. Its real strength lay in the localization of justice and administration. Charlemagne wanted each lord to set up courts in his territory and solve the problems of the people. These courts regulated the daily life of the peasants and at the same time created a link between the lord and the peasants. However, we must remember that this bond was not always fair. On the one hand, the peasants were under protection, but on the other, they had to maintain their loyalty to their lord for life. This system, created under Charlemagne, was interconnected like the links of a chain. Each lord, while protecting the land he received from the king, distributed new lands to his vassals. This led to a multi-layered structure of feudalism. It must be remembered, however, that this chain was only as strong as its weakest link. If a vassal broke his loyalty, the whole system could start to crumble. That is why feudalism was based not only on land, but also on trust. Another important element of the feudal order was the church. Charlemagne both won the support of the people and strengthened this order by taking the spiritual power of the church behind him. The church was not only a place of worship, but also a center of authority. Feudal lords needed the support of the church to protect and rule their lands, while the church could survive with the security provided by the feudal order. Charlemagne established this balance perfectly and went down in history as both a worldly and a spiritual leader. My friends, these steps taken under Charlemagne laid the foundation of feudalism in Europe. The feudal order was not only a system of land distribution, but also a way of life that affected every level of society. Peasants had to remain loyal to their lords while cultivating their land. The lords in turn prepared their armies to fight under the command of the king. This system became a structure that would shape Europe for centuries to come. But my friends, I must ask you something. Did this land-oriented structure of the feudal order only provide people with security? Or did it open the door to a kind of bondage at the cost of losing their freedom? And what role did the knights who rose like legends play at the center of this order? Where did the emergence of chivalric culture and honor codes fit into this order? In the next episode, we will explore this story, hidden in the shine of armor. Are you ready? Ah, my dear friends, imagine a morning when black sails appear on the horizon. A day that begins with silence is suddenly drowned by war cries and the smoke of burning villages. This dark landscape was the reality that the Vikings etched into the lives of Europeans. These warlike peoples, swept by the harsh winds of the north, not only sought booty and glory, but also shook the social structure of the whole of Europe. I will now tell you how the Viking raids played a role in strengthening the feudal order. The Vikings, my dear friends, stormed onto the European scene at the end of the 8th century. Emerging from the harsh geography of Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, this seafaring people were known not only for their brave warriors, but also for their skillful sailors. Their long ships carried them all over the world, from the shores of England to Frankish lands, and even to the gates of Constantinople. But the Vikings' raids were not just attempts at plunder. They exposed Europe's weaknesses and made a new order inevitable. When the Viking attacks began, Europe's central authority was already weakened. The Frankish Empire under Charlemagne's heirs was in the process of disintegration. The kingdoms of England were powerless against the Vikings. At this time, it was no longer possible for the king to provide protection. The weakness of central authority pushed people into the arms of local lords, because the lords, with their castles, knights, and soldiers, offered an answer to the people's search for security. The Viking threat further deepened the roots of the feudal system. The most effective way to survive barbarian attacks was to seek refuge in a powerful lord. In this period, peasants and small landowners offered their land and labor in exchange for the security provided by the lords. During this period, serfdom, that is, peasants' dependence on a lord, became widespread. Serfs worked under the protection of their lords, gave them part of their crops, and provided support in warfare when necessary. But this was not voluntary cooperation, but the result of a struggle for survival. Viking attacks also increased the importance of castles and knights. Lords built strong stone castles to form a line of defense against attacks. These castles were not only defensive structures, but also symbols of feudal order. Knights were the military backbone of this order. Shining in their armor, these warriors ensured the safety of both their lords and the people. But knighthood was not only a military role, it was also a system of honor and loyalty. The chaos created by the Vikings strengthened Europe's systems of local government. Lords took more authority to protect the people, while kings began to lose their central authority altogether. The feudal order was born out of necessity during this chaotic period and turned into a solid structure. The Vikings unwittingly brought about a major change in the political and social structure of Europe. But now, my friends, I would like to ask you this question. What was the role of individuals in this feudal order? How did the hopes of the serfs, the ambitions of the lords, and the knight's sense of honor balance out? And how should we define the place of the church, of spiritual leaders in this order? In the next chapter, we will go to the heart of feudal society and seek answers to these questions. Are you ready? My friends, I now invite you on a journey through the stone streets of Europe, through the stately castles of the lords and the sweat-soaked lands of the serfs. It is a time when feudalism is slowly ossifying. We cannot understand how this order works without understanding the people of that time, their lives, and their loyalties. We will now examine this hierarchy that rises like a pyramid from king to serf. But take your time, we will leave no stone unturned. We will learn a lesson from every step. The feudal hierarchy, my dear friends, was a structure in which a king sat at the top. But the king's throne was not as solid as you might think. With the erosion of centralized authority since Rome, kings could no longer rule the whole country directly. The lords who surrounded them were the real sources of the king's power. They were men who owned large territories and swore allegiance to the king. But this allegiance was a mutual agreement rather than a friendship. The king gave the lords land. The lords provided soldiers in wartime and taxes in peacetime. This was an unwritten contract, the first cornerstone of the feudal order. Lords were at the most critical points of this hierarchy. With vast territories at their disposal, it was almost as if they ruled their own kingdoms. With their knights, castles, and serfs, they were the first authority the people came into contact with. But with this power came great responsibility. Not only did the lords have to fulfill the king's wishes, but they also had to maintain order in their own lands. Therefore, they needed vassals who swore allegiance to them. Ah, there are the vassals, lords' right-hand men, their servants, and loyal soldiers. Vassals were people who were under a lord, but ruled over smaller territories given to them in return. They sealed their loyalty with a ritual, an agreement based on an oath. This oath was not just a show of allegiance. It was also the soul of the feudal order. Vassals did their lord's bidding, fought for their cause, defended their lands. Remember, my friends, this loyalty was not one-sided. Lords also had to provide protection and justice to their vassals. This interdependence built the framework of feudalism. And at the bottom of this hierarchy, dear friends, were the serfs. They were the people who worked on the land of the lords, whose labor sustained this great order. The serfs were not free. They were tied to the land. But they were not slaves either. They could not leave their land, but in return they received the protection of the Lord. Was this a condemnation or a safe haven? The answer to this question varied depending on the serf's eyes. But the truth was that without the serfs, the lords could neither protect their castles, nor the king feed his armies. The labor of the serfs was the heart of the feudal order. The most interesting part of this order, my friends, was that each layer was subordinate to the other. The king was dependent on the lords on the vassals on the serfs. This interdependence strengthened the order, but it also created weaknesses that led to its demise. Everyone was connected to each other like links in a chain. But how strong was this chain? Now let me leave you with a question, my friends. In the middle of this hierarchy, there was another throne. But this throne did not serve an earthly king, but a heavenly monarch. What was the role of the church? How did this conflict between spiritual authority and earthly power shape the feudal order? In the next episode, we will discuss the influence of the church on the feudal hierarchy. Are you ready? My dear friends, welcome to a time when the cold winds of Europe blew, cathedrals defied the sky, and a spiritual force ruled the land. As the stones of the feudal order fell into place one by one, there was another force shining among them, the Church. It was a power that not only saved souls, but ruled the land, brought kings to their knees, and left a deep imprint on the conscience of the people. Are you ready to discover together the story of the Church, one of the invisible hands of the feudal order? My dear friends, do not forget that in the Middle Ages, people were not only concerned with protecting their lands, but also their souls. In this sense, the Church was not only a place of worship, but also a power that governed, taught, and even punished society. Acting in the name of God, the clergy were present at every moment of the people. But this spiritual journey was not limited to worship. The Church was at the heart of the feudal order, shaping economic, political, and cultural structures. Perhaps the most important source of the Church's power was the enormous land it owned. Imagine that most of the most fertile land in Europe belonged to the Church. These lands were even larger than the lands owned by an ordinary lord. With the income from these lands, the Church supported both its clergy and its monasteries. It also filled its treasury with taxes from the people, called tithes. A farmer had to give 10% of the crops he grew in his field to the Church. This tax was both a religious duty and an economic obligation. But my friends, the power of the Church was not only economic. The hands that consecrated the king's crown were the hands of the Church. A king could not rule his people without the approval of the Church. Kings went to great lengths to win the support of the Church. Popes and bishops were important players in the political game of the feudal order. Sometimes the Church was even influential enough to depose kings and replace them with new ones. Imagine, the papacy sometimes acted as the real ruler of Europe. My dear friends, the Church did not only possess worldly riches, it also dominated knowledge. The monasteries were places where books were copied, scientific studies were carried out, and history was written. These sacred places preserved the legacy of ancient Greece and Rome and carried it in the future. Imagine that. In the midst of feudal order, in a dark age, knowledge survived thanks to these places of light. The Church was a source of both hope and fear in the conscience of the people. The hope of going to heaven required strict adherence to the teachings of the Church. But at the same time, the fear of hell made obedience to the Church obligatory. From confession to excommunication, pilgrimages to holy wars, everything was under the influence of the Church. The people could not dispute the power of the Church, because the Church was God's representative on earth. All these elements made the Church an integral part of the feudal order. The authority of the Church permeated every layer of this hierarchy. Lords and vassals consecrated their lands with the prayers of the Church. Serfs took the protection of the Church as a guarantee. The Church's role in the survival of the feudal order was undeniable. My friends, Robert. But did everyone like the fact that the Church had so much power? Over time, this power gave rise to controversy and rebellion. But how was this control of the Church shaken in the centuries to come? How did the reform movements change this enormous power? We will discover the answers to these questions together in the next episode. My dear friends, in the midst of the feudal age, A story written in blood and steel awaits you. From the battlefields to the cathedrals, from the palaces of the lords to the hearts of the people. Today, I will tell you of a class that became legendary not only on the battlefields, but also on the hard paths of honor and morality, knights. Let's dive into the story of these heroes who transformed from ordinary boys into noble warriors. Let us discover together how their shining armor, swords, and oaths shaped the spirit of the feudal order. My dear friends, the roots of chivalry were laid in that chaotic period when Europe was shaken by wars. In this age of Vikings, barbarian raids, and civil wars, lords needed skilled warriors to protect their lands. But these warriors were not just hands holding weapons. They were seen as protectors who would protect both the people and their lords, and at the same time fight in the name of God. While chivalry was based on the power of arms, it was also shaped by moral values and religious beliefs. This complex mix was what distinguished them from ordinary soldiers. The story of a knight usually begins as a young boy from a noble family. But remember, my friends, knighthood was not just a privilege of birth. It was a title earned through rigorous training. A young boy would be sent to a lord when he was only 7 years old. These children, known as pages, would serve in the lord's castle and receive basic lessons in morality and obedience. For a page, training was not limited to service. He cleaned weapons, polished armor, and learned skills such as riding, hunting, and war games. When a boy reached the age of 14, he entered a stage known as cavalryman or musketeer. Under the supervision of an experienced knight, these young warriors learned to use weapons, fight with swords, throw spears, and fight in armor. But, my friends, the path of knighthood was not just about swinging swords. They were also God's warriors, and therefore spirituality was also important. A would-be knight had to embrace values such as courage, loyalty, justice, and mercy. A lord or bishop would preach to the young warrior the importance of serving God, and knights swore to protect the weak, respect women, and defend justice. One of the most important moments for a knight was the ceremony in which he was knighted. This ceremony was more than just the awarding of a military title. It was the beginning of a spiritual journey. Before the ceremony, the young warrior would spend the night in prayer, asking God for help. In the morning, his sword was blessed, and he was knighted by his lord or king. This moment was a great honor, not only for the individual, but also for his family and the Lord he served. Ah, my friends, being a knight was not just about fighting heroically in battle. They were figures admired by the people, the stuff of tales and legends. They performed their feats in tournaments and were immortalized in song. But do not forget that knighthood also came with great responsibilities. In the service of a lord, knights also had to protect the people and ensure justice. On the one hand, knights represented a noble class of warriors, and on the other, they were the military backbone of the feudal order. My dear friends, no matter how lofty the ideals of chivalry, was this system always perfect? And what happened when these heroes strayed from protecting the weak and fell under the spell of power? How did the feudal order change with the rise and fall of the knights? In the next installment, we will look at the shadows of the chivalric system and the truth behind it. Now, Are you ready for the real question? My dear friends, in the feudal order of Europe, life was built on the covenant. Every stone, every sword stroke, every decision was sealed with an oath of allegiance. The subjects of this oath were the lords and the vassals or knights who served them faithfully. Let us now take a closer look at these relationships that formed the cornerstones of the feudal world, and the role knights played in this order. The backbone of a feudal system was the relationship between lord and vassal. This relationship was not just a territorial agreement, it was also based on a promise of mutual loyalty, protection, and service. A lord would grant parts of his vast territory to his vassals in pieces called fiefs. But this was not just a donation of land. Each of these pieces of land became a chain of responsibility. The vassal was obliged to protect these lands, to provide soldiers for his lord, and even to sacrifice his blood if necessary. But my friends, it was not only the vassal who had responsibilities in this relationship. A lord had to protect his vassal, defend his rights, and do whatever was necessary to ensure that he lived an honorable life. This relationship was more than a master-slave arrangement. It was an agreement of loyalty and mutual trust. That is, both parties had to be faithful to this oath. Now imagine a knight kneels before his lord. He joins his hands and places them in his lord's hands. This simple gesture opens the door to the oath of allegiance. The knight takes this oath not only for the sake of the land, but also for the sake of his honor, his family, and God. That is why these oaths are so much more than simple promises. Knights owed their loyalty not only to their lords. The oath of chivalry was built on courage, loyalty, mercy, and justice. They promised to protect the people, support the weak, and defend justice. But these promises applied not only on the battlefield, but also in everyday life. A knight's behavior had to be in accordance with this oath and moral code. Knights, seen as God's representatives, had to set an example on the eyes of both heaven and the people. The knight's vows were tested, especially in difficult times. When enemy armies were at the gates, knights were the first people a lord could count on. But remember, my friends, this loyalty was not always mutually harmonious. Sometimes power, sometimes ambition damaged these relationships. It was not always easy for a knight to remain loyal both to his lord and to his own moral values. But what about when their lord's interests were at odds with the justice of God or the people? Then the knight's oath became a matter of conscience, not just loyalty. The knights were not only the swordsmen of the lords, but also the hope and fearless defenders of the people. They were the guardians of justice, symbols of mercy, and living examples of courage. Without knights, the feudal order would cease to be a network of protection and would descend into chaos. This ancient relationship between lord and knight was one of the cornerstones that sustained the feudal world. My dear friends, the ideals of chivalry and the lord-vassal relationship have endured for centuries, even as the feudal order has been shaken over time. But was this relationship always so strong? And what happened when knightly ideals clashed with the brutality of real life? Did knights always remain honorable? And what was the greatest danger to a knight's vow? In the next installment, we will pursue these questions. You will have to wait a little longer for the answers. My dear friends, I will now take you into the magical and complex web of relationships of land, the lifeblood of the feudal world. Land was both the wealth and the power of that period. However, the system behind this power was much deeper than it seemed. The feudal economy was based not only on the power of lords and knights, but also on the labor of serfs who sustained this power. Let's explore the workings of this system and the lives of the people who depended on the land. In the feudal system, the value of land was not just about production. Land was a measure of who you were and where you stood. Lords were the owners of vast estates, and these estates were the most important source of consolidating their power. But cultivating the land was not a job expected of a lord. This is where serfs came into play. Serfs were farmers tied to the land. But don't take the word tied lightly, my friends. This tiedness meant not only to the land, but also to the authority of a lord and the rules of the system. Serfs had to cultivate their own small fields and provide for their families, while at the same time cultivating and harvesting the lord's land. This was their condition of survival, in a sense the price of the feudal world. The life of the serfs was full of sacrifice and hardship. By working for his lord, a serf devoted not only his labor, but also his time and hope. When the harvest season came, they worked day and night in the fields. But this work meant not only food, but also a crop tax that had to be paid to their lord. If a serf wanted to marry, move to another village, or make any major change in his life, he had to ask his lord's permission. This was the biggest proof that they were not free people. But remember, serfs were not slaves. They were tied to the land, but this tie made them an integral part of the system. Rather than owning them outright, the lords stood at the center of the feudal economy, keeping their lands fertile, providing for their people, and protecting them from external threats were their most basic duties. But in return for these duties, they lived in great luxury with the support and products they received from their people. In their manors, surrounded by knights, they ruled like kings. But my friends, a lord's power came from his land and the loyalty of his serfs. If the serfs did not produce enough, or if order was broken, this chain could quickly break. That is why lords often had to be careful to rule justly. Otherwise, the loyalty of their people could quickly be shaken. The feudal economy was a cycle in which everyone played a specific role. Lords ruled and protected the land, while serfs worked it. Knights protected the system from threats, and the church sanctified and legitimized the cycle. But this system also rested on a balance. As long as everyone played their role, the order would continue. But when the balance was upset, the whole system was threatened. My dear friends, this complex order of the feudal economy lasted for centuries. But no system is eternal, is it? So how did this order change? How were the serfs freed from land bondage? How did the collapse of feudalism begin? In the next episode, we will pursue these questions. Are you ready? Because the answers will turn history in a completely different direction. My dear friends, now I am going to take you to a world shaped behind stones, towers, and unshakable walls. This is the world of feudal castles, symbols not only of defense, but also of power and control. And in the shadow of these castles lies the story of the knights, the true protectors of that era, always on guard. Let's dive into the details of these fascinating structures and the life that goes on inside them. In the feudal world, building a castle was not only a defensive measure, but also a show of power. Imagine that these stone walls not only kept out enemies, but also displayed the power, wealth, and prestige of a lord. A castle was a refuge for the people around it and an impenetrable barrier for enemies. Let's start with the choice of the castle's location. It was usually built on strategic hilltops overlooking wide valleys. This height not only made it difficult for enemies to approach, but also allowed for observation of the surrounding area. Castles had walls, towers, moats, and perimeter defenses, sometimes filled with water. Every detail was a thoughtful response to the tricks of an attack. Dear friends, being behind the castle walls at that time was the greatest sense of security for a serf. But the strongest defense of a castle was not its stone walls, but the knights who stood behind them. Knights were not only soldiers in their lord's army, but also strategists and masters of defense. Castles served as a base for knights. Here they trained, donned their armor, and shaped their battle plans. During an attack, the knight's task was to control every aspect of the defense. It was their job to ensure that archers were on the ramparts, to respond quickly to attacked areas, and, if necessary, to fight on the front line when the enemy was at the gates. But their duties were not limited to war. In peacetime, too, the knights patrolled the perimeter to ensure the safety of the people, clearing the roads of pirates and protecting their lord's lands. My friends, castles were not only places of war, but also places where life went on. Within the castle walls lived the lord's family, the knights and their servants. Feasts were held in the great halls, fireplaces burned on cold winter nights, and the people found peace in the safety of the castle. But at the same time, the castle was always on the move, always ready for a battle. Weapons were kept in constant repair, and food stocks were regularly replenished. But, my dear friends, like everything else, castles could not last forever. Over time, the technology of warfare changed. The rise of cannons made these unbreakable walls impenetrable. Castles were replaced by more modern defensive structures, and chivalry took a different form in the new order. But this is not the end of the story. It is another beginning. Think about it. While cannons and gunpowder brought the end of feudal castles, what began with this change? What role did the knights play in this new era? How did the course of history change so dramatically? In the next chapter, we will discover the secrets of this transformation together. Are you ready, my dear friends? Because history, as always, will surprise us once again. My dear friends, I will now take you to a distant land, a holy land. It is the time of the Crusades, perhaps one of the most dramatic periods in human history, a time of great ideals and conflicts. It was a time when not only religions, but also the culture of chivalry took root and branched out. Let's open the dark and yet exciting pages of those times together. It all started at the end of the 11th century with the call of Pope Urbanus II at the Council of Clermont. This call echoed from the heart of the Christian world and reached the ears of knights across Europe. The aim was to reclaim the Holy Land, Jerusalem in particular, from Muslim rule. But this call was not just a religious duty. It became a movement that shaped the ideals of chivalry and the concept of honor. Think, my dear friends, what would this call mean for a knight? To defend his faith, to atone for his sins, and perhaps win eternal life. But at the same time, these crusades were an opportunity to gain new lands, wealth, and fame. It was this mix that transformed the Crusades from an ordinary war into one of the greatest military movements in history. During this period, knighthood came to be seen as a spiritual duty, not just a martial one. Knights were no longer just soldiers of their lords, but also soldiers of God. During the Crusades, many knights acted under religious orders, which made their duty even more sacred. Orders like the Knights Templar emerged during this period. My dear friends, these orders were not only warriors, but also devoted guards protecting pilgrims on holy ground. The red cross and the white cloaks they wore over their armor represented both their courage and their religious devotion. But these duties were not only a physical protection, but also a moral example. So what happened on these long and arduous journeys? The journey from Europe to the Holy Land tested the knights both physically and spiritually. Impenetrable mountains, scorching deserts, and a constant shortage of food. But despite every challenge, the knights' vows sustained them. Christian Coptazio, 4 to 7 years ago, to lead you with me to the Holy Land tested the knights' vows, sustained them even more. On April 25th, 1732, their victories in the Holy Land further ennobled the values of chivalry. Values such as courage, loyalty, and compassion were combined with this new understanding brought by the Crusades. This was not only a war, but also a cultural change. The knights returning from the campaigns brought back to Europe not only stories and spoils, but also new ideas and habits. This ushered in a period when the culture of chivalry reached its peak. Knights were no longer just heroes of the battlefield, but legends at feasts and among the people. Dear friends, the impact of these great campaigns left deep traces not only in the Christian world, but also in the Islamic world. Two different civilizations were influenced by each other as they faced each other on the battlefields. And what were the consequences of this cultural interaction later on? This is the beginning of another story. What happens when the oath of chivalry is broken? When fear replaces courage? When loyalty is tested? What path does a knight choose? The moments when the ideals of chivalry are tested, and the consequences of those moments. Are you ready? I can see the answers to those questions are hidden in the depths of history. In the next chapter, we will witness together the moments of the greatest passion of time and our greatest fear. My dear friends, I will now take you on a journey through the lush green plains of England, The year is 1215. While the feudal order of Europe has been dependent on the power of the land for centuries, we will now witness a period in which this structure begins to be shaken, a period that changes the course of history. The symbol of this period is that important document that influenced not only England, but also world history. We will now witness a period in which the small world of England, but also world history, we will now witness a period in which this King John, who was sitting on the throne of England at the time, was a very unpopular ruler among the people. Harsh taxes, poor administration, and losing wars had increased the discontent of the people and especially the nobles. The barons, the feudal lords, refused to submit to the arbitrary rule of the king and demanded the protection of their rights. The balance underlying the feudal order was based on the lords' desire to preserve their independence against the king's authority. But King John had upset this balance and tried to establish absolute authority, and this was the last straw that broke the barons' patience. By 1215, the barons were determined to confront the king. In Runnymede Meadow, just outside London, negotiations between King John and the barons resulted in the Magna Carta, which limited the influence of the feudal order on kings. This document not only protected the rights of the barons, but also laid the foundations for the rule of law in England. And so what did the Magna Carta say? My dear friends, this document was much more than a simple text. Magna Carta contained clauses that limited the king's powers, emphasized the independence of justice, and protected the rights of individuals. For example, the king could no longer collect arbitrary taxes from the barons, and no one could be imprisoned without a court order. This was a revolution not only for the barons, but for the entire feudal order. However, the impact of Magna Carta was not limited to its own time. It laid the foundation for constitutional orders all over the world, starting in England. This document is seen as the first sign of freedoms and the rule of law in the modern sense. Magna Carta clearly demarcated the boundaries of the feudal order. With this document, the barons declared that the king was only a ruler and not an absolute lord. The lord-vassal relationship within the feudal order was now also valid between the king and the barons. The king had to act as a lord, ruling his own lands, and owed a kind of loyalty to his subjects, especially the barons. Of course, peace did not immediately follow the Magna Carta. King John did his best not to fulfill these terms, and civil unrest continued in England. But the document is remembered as a spark that changed the course of history. But what about ordinary people, farmers, merchants, peasants? Did the Magna Carta mean anything to this broad mass of people? My dear friends, in the beginning this document only applied to nobles and barons. But let us not forget that every great change begins with a seed. Magna Carta paved the way for the rights of ordinary people to be defended over time. Centuries later, this document found its inspiration in the foundation of constitutions and became the first step towards freedom for ordinary people. We cannot ignore the influence of Magna Carta on knights. Knights were often the loyal protectors of their lords, and with this document the limits of their responsibilities became clearer. A knight now had an important role not only on the battlefield, but also in the protection of justice. My dear friends, Magna Carta was a major turning point, reshaping the influence of the feudal order on the kingdom. But with this document, new questions arose. The boundaries of the feudal system were now more clearly defined. But how long could this order be sustained? How would the feudal order in Europe evolve after Magna Carta? And of course, what kind of future would the people's demands for greater freedom bring? My dear friends, I am going to take you back to the last days of the Middle Ages, to the shadow of ramshackle castles and dusty chateaus. We have witnessed the glorious and at the same time turbulent period of feudalism. That nothing lasts forever, right? Every great order in human history has somehow collapsed and been replaced by a new one. And now we are going to talk about a period when feudalism began to unravel, when the order that was trapped between stone walls was shaken, when death and change were rampant. As the shadow of the Black Death falls over Europe, we will see the feudal system weakening and the culture of chivalry breathing its last breath. My friends, in the mid-14th century, a deadly visitor arrived in Europe, the Black Death. This epidemic left a devastating mark not only on people, but also on the fabric of societies. According to rumors, the disease was first carried by trade routes from Asia, spreading rapidly from port cities to the interior. The disease, which killed people in just a few days, led to one of the largest population losses in history. A third of Europe's population, perhaps more, died within a few years. Think about it now. Fields are empty, cities are silent, villages are ghost towns. But this wave of death did not only cause physical destruction, it also began to shake the foundations of the feudal system. For feudalism was a system that relied heavily on human labor. As the serfs who cultivated the fields, the soldiers who guarded the lord's castle, the people who kept the wheels of this system turning, one by one, disappeared. The system began to crumble. Oh, I remember how desperate the lords were, how they offered them more freedom to replace the serfs, even better conditions that were once unthinkable. Because they had no choice. As labor became scarce, the serfs realized their own value, and they no longer had to be tied to a piece of land. Some seized the opportunity and went to work in better conditions, in new places. So the serf system gradually dissolved. But the Black Death was not the only factor that brought the end of the feudal system. Technology and the arts of warfare also played a major role in its downfall. Knights were the most symbolic figures of feudalism. Their swords, their armor, their oaths of loyalty. But even on the battlefield, nothing remains constant. From the early 15th century, firearms began to appear on the scene in battles. Cannons and muskets suddenly rendered the knight's shiny armor useless. Those strong castles were now defenseless against cannons. My friends, how can I describe to you the change on the battlefields? The days of knights bravely attacking on horseback were replaced by disciplined lines of soldiers with muskets. War was no longer a playground of individual heroism, but of new technologies and strategies. Thus, while chivalry remained in the minds as a romantic memory, it disappeared from the stage of war. All these changes put the final nail in the coffin of feudalism. With the dissolution of the feudal system, powerful kingdoms based on central authority began to rise in many parts of Europe. Local lords were replaced by kings working on behalf of national unity. The first seeds of this new order began to germinate in the 15th and 16th centuries. People who had once been loyal to lords and knights were now united under the umbrella of nation-states. With the strengthening of centralized governments, modern states were born, and feudalism became a page in the history books. My dear friends, we are nearing the end of our journey for today. We have wandered through the gloomy yet fascinating corridors of history, talking about how the feudal order began to crumble, how knights faded from the scene as legends, and how the first seeds of modern nation-states were sown. It all sounds like a dream, doesn't it? But remember, at every corner of this dream lies the struggle of humanity, its resistance to innovation and its eventual acceptance. Now, as we say goodbye to this story together, let us think one more time. Don't the threads that bind us to the past lay the foundations of bridges to the future? I have told you many things, from the deadly shadow of the Black Death to the knight's last breath. But, dear listeners, let me ask you this. What is the strength of the human spirit in all this turbulence? Where does this perseverance come from that builds a new one after every order that is destroyed? Because the fall of feudalism was not just an end. It was also the opening of the door to the modern world. Yes, in the shadow of wars, disease, and change, people began to build a new order with faith and determination. Without this courage, history would be just a story of chaos. But, oh dear friends, history shows us something else. Every new beginning brings its own conflicts and questions. Did the modern nation-states that came with the fall of feudalism really bring peace and prosperity to humanity? Or did it sow the seeds of new conflicts? No, I would like to ask you, during all these changes, did humanity really learn the lessons it needed to learn? Or have the same mistakes been repeated in different forms? What stories await us at the next stop on this journey from the past to the future? My dear friends, you can't wait to find out what happens next, can you? But before we tell you more, we must pause for a while. Remember, history is always full of questions, and we find our own way as we search for answers. So which heroes, which epics, and which turbulent events will we trace on our next journey? Wait and see. See you next time.